Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today for the vital role of HR in change management. My name is Kaylee Hanson, and I work at GoCo. We are an all-in-one HRIS. I'm so excited to be joined by Michelle Cousins today. She has done some webinars for GoCo in the past through other different platforms and programs, and we are so excited to have her here again with us today. Just a couple housekeeping things before we get started. I will be sending the recording after the presentation, either today or tomorrow, so be on the lookout for that. Additionally, I will share the Sherman HRCI codes towards the end of the webinar, so make sure to stay around for that as well. And with that, Michelle, do we want to get started?
Yes, that sounds great. And thank you. Welcome, everybody. I did want to let you know a little bit about myself. You can see this on the slide. And of course, you'll be getting a copy of the slides for your reference as well. I do a lot of work with organizations on talent management, operational excellence, and of course, around even just business planning, strategic planning, and even succession and contingency planning. And so I've been doing this a long time. I've worked with a lot of different types of organizations. And so hopefully you're going to find that what I have to say today is helpful. I do make my slides very content rich because I do want you to be able to continue to refer to them, maybe even share them with colleagues as well. And of course, change is, the only constant we have today, right? And within HR, there's a lot of value that you can bring in terms of helping others to manage, adapt to, and even embrace change. So what I'll be covering today is I'll be talking about how to assist leadership in driving change, what that means in terms of the communication that goes with it, as well as implementing it and tracking it, how we can really think about the types of answers to give workers to kind of support them in that regard. And then also what some of the training needs are that might be associated with change, as well as how to really gain buy-in from people, because of course change can be uncomfortable for a lot of people. And what does that mean in terms of even updating the roles and responsibilities associated with any change in your organization? So I will save a couple of minutes or so for questions at the end. And I'd like to thank GoCo for sponsoring today's session. And with that, let's get right into it. In terms of the history of the workplace, there's really been obviously a lot of different periods in time where different styles of management and nuances have changed and evolved. So think about back when we had the pre-industrial age and things were all small businesses, typically mom and pop, and somebody ran the business and pretty much was all hands on deck. And then, of course, that changed to what we have in terms of corporate America, for instance, where we saw that we had a lot more hierarchy, along with that, maybe some bureaucracy as well. And so we started to need more rules and standard operating procedures as part of that. We saw more layers of management. And then right around the 1990s, we saw a lot of world instability start to affect businesses, as well as global competition, the Japanese influence of management styles. And so we saw teams develop, we saw downsizing, re-engineering, quality assurance, empowerment. And I was thinking back to how I first worked in my career, and I did a lot more individual work than I do today. And currently, we pretty much work in teams, more so than not. But really, we're living in this digital, mobile, social media age, which means that we have to be very agile. And we have to help other people to be agile as well. And that's true in terms of the relationships that we have in the workplace, the networks that we form, instead of that traditional command and control mentality of how managers manage today. It's much more through a sense of influence. And more work is done in teams, as I mentioned, but that also means that we just have much more fluid work environments. And I think post-pandemic, we're seeing that is continuing well beyond the pandemic as well. Let me talk a little bit about some business trends. This is my little top 10 list, I guess you'd call it. And you see a diagram there on the right, and it's a reminder that your organization, whether you're a for-profit, not-for-profit, or other type of entity, you're nested within your marketplace, of course, but even the broader industry itself and even the broader business environment. And when we think about the types of things that are affecting your organization, obviously technology is hugely important. In the past, we've thought about technology as more kind of tools to get your work done, whereas today we see technology as really part of the overall strategy of an organization. That also ties with innovation. And we used to think of innovation as, maybe the cutting edge companies, the emerging companies, or certain industries. But really, everybody needs to approach work with a sense of innovation today. We can't rest on our laurels. And then also the translation of data and knowledge into new products and services, where companies are harvesting the data that they collect about their customers or potential customers, and they're repackaging that information and sometimes selling it as its own product or service. Of course, customers have more influence than ever before. They also can learn more about your company more easily than ever before. And so we are seeing that there's a lot more customization to meet the needs of individual customers, maybe even involving the customers in advancements in our products and services. There's just faster and faster pace of change. And I think you feel that probably in your work lives as well as in your personal lives, right? And there's more sources of disruption, and the significance of the disruption is also much more significant as well. We can think about human capital as an asset that we have. So I know traditionally, companies have thought about physical assets and financial assets, but we can also think about people as our assets. And I think today that really is a big differentiator from one company to a next, making sure you have the best talent and that you retain the best talent. And of course, we're seeing a lot of blurring of lines between organizations, as well as even within organizations in terms of the roles and responsibilities that people play, how these different partnerships, even with outside organizations, are affecting business as well. Some people today don't want to work as W-2 employees for a variety of reasons. So we are seeing that, we're having to engage people maybe on different terms, where we have a lot more independent contractors, or maybe, there's a lot of people working as gig workers, or maybe part-time workers, or maybe even just, contingent or seasonal. We are also looking at leadership differently as well. I teach a lot of courses on leadership, and traditionally we thought of leaders as the people who were at the tops of organizations, but really everybody needs to, what I call, own their jobs today. And that means that people can be leaders in any type of position. And then the last one, of course, that shift of environmentalism from social cause to business cause, where we're seeing that we're not just maybe doing what's good for the environment because it's the right thing to do, but frankly, it can actually save us money as well. So those are kind of some of the broad brush things that are really affecting pretty much every industry today. Of course, we have a lot of emerging concerns as well. We've got a lot more global and interconnected competition than ever before. And if you think that you're a small business that is pretty local, if you have a website, you're part of the global fabric, right? Economic uncertainty is pretty prevalent, and I think that that affects a lot of how people feel about change, as well as the business decisions that go along with that as well. Thinking about the environment and the climate in particular is starting to escalate in terms of how quickly things are starting to change, and so that's escalating, if you will, our level of adaptability. We're also seeing increased customer expectations as well. We can't just sort of, rest on our laurels. We always have to be moving that bar forward. And in terms of technology, we're not just seeing that we have a lot more different variations of technology affecting our work, but we're also seeing an acceleration in technological change. And you can even think about what's happening with artificial intelligence these days. We also have more what I think of as first time business disruptions. So hacking and sabotage actually is grossly underreported. A lot of companies are actually trying to sort of negotiate the the hacking and sabotage with those actors directly, as opposed to going through the FBI or the police or the government to assist them. Supply chain complications, we saw that first really heat up during the pandemic, but it's been a cautionary tale where companies are realizing their vulnerabilities that could be associated with the different supply chains they rely on. And of course, even after the pandemic, there have been aftermath effects. People do still get COVID, by the way. And of course, people are on the lookout for, is it going to be the bird flu next, or, what's going to happen next, kind of waiting for the other shoe to drop. So as we think about these, we can also consider where jobs are headed in the future as well. Interestingly enough, 85% of the jobs that'll exist in 2030 may not exist yet. That's kind of daunting, right? I mean, talk about change. Automation is driving a lot of it, of course. We're seeing that more and more tasks are being automated, that we're seeing skill shortages in some areas as well. So it's very uneven underneath the surface. So when you hear those statistics on the evening news about unemployment or inflation, remember, there's always a lot going on below the surface. And so we see robotics affecting industries, 3D printing, virtual reality, even autonomous vehicles. And those are really dramatically changing how people do their current jobs, as well as what that means for their future jobs. So as automation increases, that means that the less of some of those manual things that people kind of have to clunk through, they're going to be relying more on their soft skills more so than ever before. And so really thinking about how we're helping people to develop and enhance their skills around emotional intelligence, conflict resolution, their public speaking skills, leadership, empathy, ethics, and so on. We definitely have a much more blended workforce today, where we see that people are working in more of what we call an atypical fashion, very customized schedules and regimens. Still have a significant number of people who are working remotely or maybe even hybrid. And like I said, there are people that want to be gig workers. They don't necessarily want to be W-2s for a variety of reasons. Look at this stat below that. Over 80% of large corporations are expected to increase their flexible workforce in the future. And so again, you got to be thinking about this as you're coming up with the different job descriptions, as well as helping individuals through change as well. We're also seeing new models of artificial intelligence, of course, and just how that thinking is done and how it evolves through technology. That means that we really have to help people and ourselves, frankly, we're not immune to this in HR ourselves, to help people to upskill, always raising the bar, to instill a sense of agility, and of course, even to help them in terms of the internal mobility. So how much are you making sure that people can kind of pivot internally and switch gears and do something different, for instance? We have flatter organizations today than ever before, where we have fewer layers and we have people doing a lot of dynamic roles instead of maybe just one function that's more repetitive. And we even have encore careers, where people are going back out of retirement for many reasons, but also maybe going back to careers that they've had earlier in their life stages as well. So let me talk about how we can really think about preparing for change and what that means in terms of ensuring a smooth transition, because that's the name of the game to get the best outcome for our organizations. So as I mentioned, changes are only constant, right? And no organization is exempt from change. And so, if you think you can put the brakes on change, you've probably learned the hard way you can't do that, right? 70% of change initiatives fail. And that's a statistic put out by McKinsey. I've seen other statistics that show, for instance, that projects and things involved with change. I've seen other stats that say 50 to 60% from like Harvard Business Review and from Forbes. Whether it's 50, 60, or 70%, that's really significant. And so can you afford to have those kind of investments in change and then have them not pan out? Probably not. Why do they tend to fail? Could be bad management, poor implementation, could be just bad luck, right? And so the more that we kind of plan for the future, the more likely it is that we are going to be successful in whatever changes we want to make. So that does mean you have to really understand your own organization's plans and how those plans link back to day-to-day work. You also want to map how current activities may need to change as a result of what you're seeing in the future. What does that mean in terms of new activities that people may need to perform, maybe even things that they need to stop doing as well. So you think about how those roles and responsibilities will change. And of course, you can play a very vital role in helping both managers and employees with the associated transition. Now, the first thing you should be thinking about is really unearthing why you're making a change in the first place. And it could be that you were at the table when those discussions were held, or it could be that you're kind of being involved after the fact. To the extent possible, by the way, I really, with my own clients, always advocate to have HR as part of the planning process, having a voice in that, because if you think about it, whether it's strategic plans or business plans or whatever you want to call your plans, people are at the heart of whether or not those plans are going to actually be successful. So you do play a very important role in that. So you do want to understand the history of, where the organization has been, what it's accomplished, as well as what its plans are for the future. That means understanding what those long-term goals are, as well as the objectives or the initiatives and projects that are associated with it. You see an arrow there up at the top, and it's just a reminder that you should be connecting the dots in your organization between those long-term goals and what that means in terms of actually executing all the way down to the task by task type thing. Do you understand the vision? Vision is a picture of the desired future state, about where the organization wants to go and what impact it wants to have. The mission is really what business you're in the first place. The goals are typically very overarching, tend to be kind of, maybe multi-year or things you're going to get done over the coming year. Objectives, I tend to think of as SMART goals. If you're not familiar with SMART, specific, measurable, achievable, realistic, and time-bound. And having good SMART sub goals or objectives that can really guide the organization in measurable ways that you can actually objectively decide if success was reached or not. And so you should be making sure that your managers, your staff are thinking about things in those more objective ways, especially when it comes time to do things like performance reviews, where you want to make sure that things are very concrete. As far as activities, this is really about how people are going to get work done. And obviously the managers should have a good sense of that. But again, are they actually communicating that effectively to the employees? And of course, relationships are about who's going to be involved in executing something, and then also who's going to be affected by it, and maybe not necessarily the doer, but affected in other ways. We do need to think about having organizational cohesion, right? That's a descriptor I use to make sure that you're thinking about things in terms of whether everyone's kind of rallying together. Do people really hold your company's values at heart? Do they even know what they are? I think companies spend a lot of time sort of wordsmithing that kind of thing and putting it up by the elevators and putting it on their website. But do they walk the talk? Is this something that you embrace and you also remind people to embrace? And how are you affecting your management in that regard? As far as organizational commitment, there's something called affective commitment, not effective, but affective. And it's the emotional attachment to, or the identification with, or maybe the involvement in an organization. So when we think about how we keep our best people, how we keep them motivated, how we get them enthusiastic about change, then they should have some bond, in other words, to the organization. And of course, it's important in general because it's going to help to lower turnover, to keep motivation high, and as I said, to embrace change. We do want to think about what those shared values are that kind of drive people to do their best work. And are those values easily understood? Are they positive? Do they actually connect people not only to the organization, but to each other? And are they really consistent with your mission, vision, values, and goals? And so hopefully people are on the same page with that. If you're not familiar with value congruence, it's this idea that someone's individual values are in alignment with those of the organization. So typically individuals have additional values that they care about, but can we safely say that they also support the values of the organization? So communication is really important throughout this process. We can think about communicating with people before we make a change, as well as during and after a change. And this is just a little reminder. This is slide 12 of the sort of planning that should go into communication. It's interesting. We plan a lot of other things in our lives. We plan schedules and inventory and budgets and maybe even, vacations and all of that. But do we really spend enough time planning for communication? And this is where you can be hugely helpful to your management team. Help them to put together a communication plan when you are going through change. And it could be change across the entire organization, or maybe within a certain department or even location. So who is the audience that you are directing any associated communication to? What is it that needs to be communicated to them? A description of what that should include. Who's responsible for generating that communication? And then what is the type of format that is going to be used for that communication? Is it going to be email? Is it going to be town hall meetings? Is it going to be a combination of different things? And then how frequently is the communication going to occur? And if you frame it out this way, then you can think about whether you have, for instance, in change, you may have employees, of course, you may have different types of employees that need different degrees of communication. And then you may have other stakeholders as well, maybe vendors or board members or regulators or whoever those external stakeholders may be. So let me talk a little bit about stakeholders, because again, those are going to be instrumental in our success as well. First, we want to identify who our stakeholders are. So anytime I'm going through a change and I'm helping my clients with change, we discuss, okay, who is going to be impacted by the change? And then also who will impact the change. So it's a two-sided coin, the people who are going to influence change and the people who are going to be influenced by the change. So make sure you're thinking about both sides of that coin. And again, some of the stakeholders may be internal and some may be external. As far as assessing their roles, think about what that means in terms of whether they're going to participate in the change or not, what their unique needs are, how important a given stakeholder is, and how much control they have over the circumstances and the situation. Really understand how any changes are going to affect them, as well as how they may affect the transitions as well. And of course, remember that different stakeholders are going to have different points of view and different value in the whole equation. Now, you see a little comic strip there, or a little cartoon, I guess, no Thursdays out. How about never? Is never good for you, right? So it's one thing to identify your stakeholders, but then to actually engage them to make sure that, first of all, you want to get them on board with the change, but also get whatever you need from them as part of it. And there's a lot of different ways that you can reach out to people. It could be through meetings, conference calls, surveys, focus groups. It could even be brainstorming sessions, for instance. And so you do want to think carefully about the best way to reach people. So think about that communication plan template that I showed you on the previous slide. And in that, you may then start to parcel out different types of stakeholders in terms of how you're going to interact with them during this change time period. So if you haven't heard of John Kotter, he's kind of a well-known guru in this space. And in terms of how he has looked at change, he talks about it in 8 steps. And I've included the link there in case you want to delve into it a little bit more. But step 1, he says, really light a fire for change in the first place. And of course, light a fire means, are you getting people enthusiastic, fired up, excited, and so on. Step 2, get the right people on board. Maybe there are people that you can have be change agents. I'll talk a little bit more about that, or otherwise known as cheerleaders in many cases, so that they can help others who might be a little bit more reluctant. You want to paint a compelling picture. And so can you help to guide your management a little bit on that in terms of what does that look like? How would you describe what the end result of this change is going to look like in a very appealing kind of way? And then also just the aspect of communication that I already mentioned, before, during, and after the change. Are you also thinking about how you can remove obstacles and help people to make their own decisions? And that's how we really think about helping people in that regard. So for instance, I often think about management today as more about how we can actually help people in terms of support that they need, as opposed to jumping in initially. And so are you really kind of advising your management on how they can provide resources, and then how they can also remove obstacles? Step 6 is all around achieving and celebrating quick wins early. And so the more that we can see early success and help people to understand what success looks like. And obviously, if we can have some incremental wins, then that's going to also help to sustain people, especially if this is ultimately a long-term change that we're making. And then don't just focus on the immediate wins, right? We've still got to focus on the big picture and tying it back so that we can use that to reinforce what we're trying to accomplish long term. And then step 8 is really around finding ways to actually make the changes stick. And so when we make changes, we want to sort of think about how we're going to institutionalize those changes so that they actually do last the way that we intend them to. Let me talk a little bit about how we can conduct some impact assessments. And this is slide 15. And this may be something you want to refer back to, as well as sort of almost like a checklist. So you want to clearly define the nature and the scope of change in the first place. Make sure that that's really clearly delineated, and then determine who is going to be affected by that change, right? As I was describing, who are the different stakeholders. You want to identify them. You want to analyze their roles, their responsibilities, their expectations, their concerns, as I mentioned, and really look at the various aspects that may be impacted by the change, in terms of like, are different parts of your business going to be affected differently than other parts of the business? And then develop criteria so you can really assess the impact on each category. Meaning, are you looking at, different categories of, the finance department versus the marketing department? How are you thinking about maybe different layers in all of this? And then you assess the current state of the organization, or maybe it's a process that you're changing or some kind of system implementation. Always take a close look at how are things operating before the change, so you can better determine whether the change was really beneficial afterwards. So getting some kind of baseline is really what I'm talking about there. And then you want to envision the future state after the change has been implemented. And as I talked about, are you painting that vision for other people as well? You want to evaluate the gap between the current state and the future state. That gap analysis helps you to size up what that transition may look like. If part of the future is you need people to have different skill sets, maybe they're going to be using some new technology, for instance, then you would say, okay, I've got a gap there. I've got to make sure that I'm providing the training. And then you really back into when is the best timing of that training, what's the best way to roll it out, and so on. You want to identify what the risks are, what the obstacles are that are associated with the change, of course. Every change has some element of risk, and I think we should not shy away from taking risk. I always say that, the spirit of what I'm describing here on this slide is to take calculated risks, where you're actually really, thoughtfully considering everything in advance. And then identify potential opportunities that change might bring. So always thinking beyond maybe the the literal effect of that change, are there other ripple effects that could be very positive as well? You want to develop strategies to mitigate some of the negative impacts, because there may be some negative impacts. Maybe, in totality, the change is viewed as a positive one, but there could be some side effects maybe. So really thinking about how to mitigate those. And then, of course, develop that communication plan so that people are kept informed. I always say err on the side of over communication, by the way. So, if you're going to err, better to err on that side. And then identify those training needs for anybody affected by the change, set up mechanisms so that you can actually monitor the progress of any implementation of the change, making sure you're collecting feedback along the way. Sometimes we can still, modify things as we're implementing. So I know a little bit of, it sounds a little bit like building the plane while you're flying, but a little different in the sense that you would have had a game plan, but you continue to tweak it. And then document the entire change impact assessment process, really looking at the findings, the analyses, the strategies, and the outcomes associated with that change. Now, I mentioned at the beginning that, of course, typically change does mean that at least someone's roles and responsibilities are going to be changing. And you see a diagram there on the right-hand side that's a reminder that whatever that strategic planning is saying in terms of the goals, the objectives, the needs, the changes that are coming through, that's going to drive work design as well as job analysis, competency modeling, job design, and then also workplace transition. And if you're not, fully familiar with those terms, we can think about a job as a collection of tasks that are performed by someone. Job analysis, we can think about collecting information about work tasks, tools, and methods. And of course, when we think about work design before that stage, we're really just thinking more generally about what those work priorities would be. And so, of course, as we get down into job design, we're really thinking about which tasks should be kind of grouped together in one job versus another. So thinking about the bundling. So if you have existing job descriptions and you're going through some kind of change, how those tasks may get bundled may be very different than how they're being done today. And of course, that all then leads to your workplace transition. So thinking about which activities should be grouped together. Again, comparing the current and future needs, looking at what characteristics or capabilities people need in order to be successful in those responsibilities, and then making sure that you're designing it so that it's more conducive to success. That also means that you should be helping with some of the incremental changes that go on. Are you identifying and connecting talent pools with individual development plans so that you're moving people forward? Are you also using evidence-based performance data as well as developmental and succession planning data? And, some people are no longer going to be needed, or maybe they're not going to be able to embrace the change, or they're not going to be able to learn the new skill sets. And so, yes, you may have, some job loss as part of this as well. And you may be creating some new positions where you hire from outside. So let's talk about your role in managing change and handling resistance. In managing transition, you do want to select change agents that can really help influence other people. So you're not the only person or the only department that is influencing change. You have other people sort of in your arsenal, I guess. You want to create that vision of the desired shifts and results and get other people to help with that messaging. And they're going to not only help with the messaging, but hopefully they're going to role model the behavior that's needed as well. Maybe they're going to try out the new system first, or they're going to help to select whatever the new process is, but getting them involved early. And then create an urgency for change. So even if your organization is doing really well, it doesn't mean that you're immune from change. And don't just approach change when it's sort of imposed upon you, but rather be proactive about it, because that's how your organization will stay doing well. So you want to inform people about what the driving forces are behind the change, what those consequences can be if they don't adapt to change, because let's face it, people's sort of default recourse is they'll only change if they have to. And so really understanding the consequences if you don't change. You can talk about, listen, this is what's going to happen to the company if we don't continue to evolve and change. And so you can talk about it in that more collective way, but also talk about it in the individual kind of way, because frankly, that's how people generally are going to make decisions in their lives. They're going to think about how it affects them personally. You want to focus more on carrots than on sticks, meaning, what are some positive ways to motivate people as opposed to some punitive ways. You want to break down the large changes into smaller steps. You probably heard the adage, how do you eat an elephant? One bite at a time. All right. Well, same type thing here. Break it down so it's more palatable, more manageable. You want to help guide other people because, of course, some people are going to have a lot of anxiety about change in and of itself. Truly acknowledge their concerns and feelings. If you ignore their trepidation, that is not going to help your organization. And then you also want to role model the behavior yourselves, right? So championing a compelling future with a real spirit of possibility, encouraging people to try new things. And by the way, if people get stepped on every time they try something new, they're going to be very hesitant to do that. So do you have practices in place that allow people to experiment with things, to maybe make some mistakes in the spirit of innovation? And then identify what those critical success factors for the change are, and make sure that you are fairly evaluating people based on that and also rewarding progress. Obviously, many times when people go through change, they're going to need some training, they're going to need some support. And of course, all changes call for some form of training, whether it's hard skills, soft skills, whether it's monumental or maybe even incidental. And so you want to consider the type of training needed in the first place and what that means in terms of how it's going to dovetail with their day-to-day responsibilities as well. Who should receive the training? What will the training be designed to achieve in the first place? How is it going to be executed? Is it going to require any tools or any equipment? Who's going to be responsible for delivering the training? Are you going to do it in-house? Are you going to engage with someone outside? Are people going to have to travel for it? Are they going to be able to do it electronically or on their own schedules? How long is the training going to take? And of course, how much is it going to cost, right? Obviously, that's a consideration as well. So ultimately, there are ways that we can help people adapt to change by sharing our own personal experiences. That can make things relatable for people. And you may want to encourage your managers and your other leaders in the organization to think about making themselves a little vulnerable. We tend to think that when we make ourselves vulnerable that we look weak, but in actuality, it tends to make us relatable to other people. And by the way, if you want to learn more about vulnerability, Brene Brown has a lot of extensive research around this, great videos and great books. You want to provide a history of the anticipated change. How did this come to be that we're making this change? What drove it? You want to provide reasons for the change, the benefits, not only again for the organization, but down to the individual level. Help people to really see the positives of this, the potential impact. Listen to what their questions and concerns are. Make sure that you are responding to them. Sometimes it's going to be, that's a valid concern and I don't really have an answer for that. Don't be afraid to actually say that to people, because they'll actually still feel at least somewhat better that their fears are being acknowledged. Let people know also what's not going to change, right? I think sometimes that gets forgotten in the whole thing. And then people start to import their own judgments on that, and they may be way off base. You also want to acknowledge the pros and cons that are associated with the change and be realistic about that. Don't over sugarcoat it, because people see right through that, and they'll probably become very cynical if you're not really being straightforward with them. And then agree on what those resources are going to be that they're going to be provided, what the strategies are for change. Celebrate by confirming that this is really a partnership, right? I mean, we're only going to be successful if we buy in together and work together. And you also want to acknowledge and thank people for their cooperation and their contributions to change as well. Now, some people are going to need to be persuaded, right? So you want to think about what your power sources are. Now, I know power gets kind of a negative connotation in our culture, but the word is not a negative word. It's how we use power that can be viewed positively or negatively. So power is this ability to influence other people to do something that maybe they would not have done otherwise, right? So you influence them about their point of view, and then you persuade them to take action differently based on what you've sort of influenced them on. You can have hard power, legitimate, reward, coercive, soft, expert, reverent. There's a lot of different forms of power. It's not just about things like title or punitive type measures, or whether you're going to be able to give them some kind of reward. Those could be in your arsenal, but also I think that in the coercive, by the way, I tend to see as not my go-to. Coercive power is kind of the do it or else, which you usually just get compliance if you go to coercive. But soft power is really the idea that you have credibility in your actions themselves. Expert power is about expertise, of course. Reverent power is the likability factor. And we do find that if we like people, we're more likely to listen to them, frankly. So we do want to move past compliance. We certainly don't want resistance. We want true commitment from people. And the more that we can assess their needs, their wants, their styles, then we're going to better find a way to appeal to them in a manner that is truly palatable for them. There's a concept called social capital, and with that, reciprocity. And if you haven't ever read Adam Grant's book, Give and Take, you may want to check that book out as well. And he talks a lot about how social capital is this idea that, we're doing things for each other all day long in different interactions. And by giving something, there's sort of implicitly in the air that at some point you're going to call in that favor and someone's going to do something for you, right? And so thinking about that angle of it. You do want to address people's resistance to change, and you really want to get the heart of what the true reason is. And sometimes the reason they're telling you is not the true reason. So you do want to try to ask a lot of questions and really kind of unearth that. There are different types of resistance. Some people are going to be very aggressive. I think we kind of know what that looks like, where they're going to be very outspoken, maybe even hostile about it. People who are passive, they're going to be difficult because they're going to seem like they're going along with things, but they don't really care that much. And passive behavior isn't necessarily as productive as active behavior, right? Now, the most insidious is passive aggressive, where people pretend that they're going along with things, but they actually don't agree with the change, and they can actually drag their feet. Even worse, they can try to sabotage the change as well. So that is the most insidious. You do want to do things like playing devil's advocate. So if you're not familiar with that, troubleshooting, asking people, okay, tell me, what am I missing? What won't work with this change? And that's a way to get those concerns out on the table and then involve them in helping to think about how to address those concerns. Different people are going to have different reasons for resistance. Employees may have very different reasons than your managers, of course. And so we all can kind of look at that and think about what that means in terms of the power buttons that we should be pushing as a result. Some people are going to continue to resist change, right? And you see a cartoon there. What if we don't change at all and something magical just happens, right? People get comfortable. They don't want to have to step out of their comfort zone. And so the more that you can get people to participate in formulating the change in the first place, the more likely they are to buy into it. Obviously, communication is going to play a huge role in that, and having transparent access to information so that they don't think that there's some hidden agenda behind it all. The more that we give the training and development that people need, that's going to ease their minds about their own functionality and whether they're going to be able to do the things that are being asked. That also applies to giving them the tools that they need as well. And obviously, technology is a predominant tool, but it could be other types of tools as well. We may even need to use some negotiation. And maybe there are some things, I go back to Give and Take by Adam Grant. Maybe there are some things that don't really cost the company anything or cost you anything that you can offer to someone in order to induce them to change as well. Some people may need some stress management assistance. Maybe there are some things that you can do. Maybe you have an EAP, an employee assistance program, that can help people with some of their mental health issues. Maybe there's something through their health insurance provider that can help with stress management as well. Because let's face it, we've got more than that than ever before, both at work and outside of work. And just really validating and addressing their concerns. And again, coercion is really a last resort. It doesn't typically work, at least not long term. Some people are just not going to change. And so first of all, show some empathy. Empathy doesn't mean you have to agree. It means that you're seeking to understand where they're coming from. Make sure that you are eliminating any barriers to success. You should probably ask some questions about that. What can we do to eliminate anything that's getting in the way? You do want to be firm. You want to highlight the impact to the business and, of course, to their career potential as well. And so it's not just about what happens to their jobs in the moment, but you want to also think into the future. What does that mean in terms of maybe some future opportunities for them? You want to assist your managers in updating the performance expectations associated with the change as well. And you want to align whatever those work incentives are that they have with long-term goals. And if you're not familiar with Daniel Pink, he's written a lot of great books. A book in particular that I mentioned here is Drive, and it's all about motivation. And he talks in the book about three layers or levels of motivation: 1.0, 2.0, and 3.0. And he says, listen, people in 1.0, they're just showing up to punch a clock. They've got to pay their bills, and pay their rent, and buy food. And that's probably not the motivation level we want, the work to survive. We want people at least to be at motivation 2.0, where people are focused on those external or extrinsic kind of rewards. Maybe they're looking for a bonus, or they're trying to avoid getting a negative performance review. So those external type things can be helpful. But what he says is, we'd really like to get people to motivation 3.0, where they do the work because they really care from within. And that is where we get the best work from people. So going back to what I've described about engaging them and involving them in formulating the change is one of the best ways for them to embed that from within. You should be thinking about how you are going to both identify and fill any gaps in skills or resources due to whatever changes you're going through. So think about what those traits are that are, representing adaptable workers. And as you are recruiting new people, by the way, I would say whether you're going through change or not, this is something that's so important to be looking at when you are vetting candidates, is how adaptable they are. Are they also really comfortable with technology? Because we know technology is going to continue to evolve. Do they really support having agile teams? Agile teams are the kinds of teams that are going to shift gears pretty frequently, and some teams are going to break up, other ones are going to form. So there's much more of a fluid environment there. You want to drive continuous improvement by really quickly responding to any changes in trends and innovation, destabilization, things going on in your industry. As I mentioned earlier, you really want to encourage a calculated sense of risk taking, and you want to guide the employees' curiosity so that they are seeking innovation as something that they're just kind of genuinely interested in the first place, which is a very different way of thinking about an employee's job than, say, 20 years ago, when people were told, you don't need to worry about that, just stay in your lane, right? Today, we want people to ask a lot of questions. That's how we improve our organizations. We should also be building and maintaining trust and rapport and authenticity, of course. We should be really fostering open-minded discussions. And so, like I said, encouraging people, not just allowing them to ask questions. And of course, when people are behaving inappropriately or unproductively, are we, of course, curbing that behavior as well? And are we using techniques to help resolve emerging issues that, of course, are coming at us almost every day? So let me talk about what we should be considering after we make a change and we're evaluating the success of the change and the transition that went through it. So when we monitor change, we should be thinking about those transition plans. We don't just say, let's make a change and you snap your fingers and we go from where we are to where we want to be, right? That takes time. So thinking about what those desired results are, how long it's going to take to achieve those results, who needs to collaborate to make that happen, or who are we going to be relying on? So going back to that stakeholder mentality, identify what resources are going to be needed in order for us to be successful, how we can mitigate risk. And that does mean looking at indicators, and two types in particular: leading indicators and lagging indicators. Leading indicators are things that give us early warning signs if things are not quite panning out, and lagging indicators are after we've implemented the change, follow on things that may continue to be affected. We can think about milestones. Milestones are significant periods of achievement. Maybe you have a major initiative that's going to take the next year or 2 years to roll out, and maybe there are milestones along the way. Stage gates are those go, no go decision points where we may see that we may change our mind about making the change as a result. Now, you do want to be careful about metrics that you're measuring. Obviously, you've got to be able to have the data in order to measure it. But also sometimes we might sort of instigate what we call perverse behavior. Perverse is not anything sexual in this content. Perverse behavior is the unintentional behavior where maybe people cut ethical corners because maybe the change that's being asked is too difficult for them otherwise. We also want to be careful about metrics that might cost too much to track, or they might be too hard to explain, or they might just be unnecessary. And I include a grid on that. That's slide 26, just as a reminder that it is kind of like a project plan, right? That we're thinking about all of those types of things that would go into monitoring the progress of a project. You also want to assess organizational health during any kind of change. So is the organization performing at its highest potential? And how do you even know? So again, you should be at the table with the business heads, looking at what those metrics are in terms of productivity, effectiveness, efficiency. Look at things like your organizational network analysis, ONA, if you're not familiar with that. It's kind of like taking an X-ray of the organization's inner workings. And so remember when I talked about getting a baseline in the first place? You want to think about, what does that baseline look like in terms of how things are done currently? If you don't have standard operating procedures outlined, that's part and parcel to that as well. But looking at people analytics, even things like diversity and inclusion, innovation, employees' performance, their motivation, understanding different relational dynamics between employees, and then also just having some sample metrics to monitor during change. So looking at whether or not things are progressing in the time periods that you expected. Is the quality there? Different key performance indicators, that's what KPI stands for, around things like time, quality, quantity, and of course financials, but then also personnel related types of metrics. So turnover by employee type or department, things like the time it takes to fill those needed jobs that may result from the change, the gaps between the current and required skills, and whether you're able to close those gaps or at least shorten them. And then, of course, how many below average performers are in critical jobs, which can be a big wake-up call in general as well. So you gather feedback from employees, you make sure that the changes that are made are well defined, well communicated. Use feedback methods that also really suit the nature of the changes and the size of your organization. So whether it's doing surveys or focus groups, maybe you're doing some one-on-one interviews, or using suggestion boxes, maybe you have regular team meetings, a lot of different ways that we can solicit feedback today. And you want to assure people that their feedback is going to be anonymous, that it's going to be kept confidential as well. So those are two separate words, by the way. Confidentiality doesn't mean it was anonymous, right? And so we want to have both, and that's going to allow people to really be as candid as possible. You want to organize and analyze the data that you collect, kind of culling through it for some common themes, different patterns, different outliers. Based on whatever analysis you use, you want to really identify the findings, the trends on, what is working, what is not working, and so on. And then prioritize the insights. What will have the most significant impact on the changes and on the organization, and then communicate that feedback. So back to your employees as well as other stakeholders, you want to be very transparent about what was learned from this change that you made. What does the feedback tell you in terms of maybe additional actions that should be taken, different adjustments, and then continue to monitor the impact as you move forward as well. In identifying additional areas for enhancement or improvement, this is just a little reminder that we never stay in place, right? So as you're implementing one change, other changes are kind of filtering in, if you will, in a very scaffolded kind of way. So you want to scan for early warnings of emerging trends. You want to analyze information to lead to decisions and solutions, respond to any of the emerging opportunities and risks, and then start adjusting your original roadmap accordingly. And that means that we continue to scan, adjust, and so on. And so it is really a cycle that is ongoing. So I thought I would just share some additional resources with you here. This is slide 30, in case you want to learn a little bit more about all of this as well. And some points just to remind you of as we get ready to wrap up here. Hopefully the things I've mentioned are not only going to help you to navigate change more successfully, but it's going to help your organizations. And that means that you've got to be comfortable with change yourselves, of course, as well. So we have a few minutes left here. I'm going to open it up for any questions that may be in the queue here. I'm also going to share my contact information. Many times people have questions after the fact, or they're just not comfortable asking a particular question in front of a group like this. So I'll leave that up while we entertain any questions. Are there any questions in the queue?
Awesome. Thank you so much, Michelle. We had a couple questions come in before the webinar, but you covered every single one of those. So don't need to touch on those. We do not have any currently in the Q&A, but still, if any of our participants have questions, please feel free to put them in there. While we're waiting, Michelle, do you mind if I share my screen really quick?
Yeah, go ahead. I'll stop sharing. Go ahead.
Thank you. And thank you again, everyone, for joining us today. So I'm just going to pop up a quick little coffee offer from GoCo. So if you're interested to learn more about how a HRIS can help you in many forms of HR, whether that be your admin tasks or your people or even navigating that change, please feel free to go to goco.io/coffee, or additionally, you can say that you'd like to in the poll that I have up. Let's see, it looks like we have the question in the Q&A was about SHRM and HRCI code. So I just shared those in the chat. If anyone else has any questions, please feel free to reach out to either Michelle or myself, and I will be sending the recording out either today or tomorrow. Michelle, is there anything that you wanted to end on?
No, I just want to thank everybody for their attendance. And again, if you're looking for a copy of the slides, I'll just go ahead and share my screen real quick here. So, and I assume you're sending them out as well, but if anyone is looking for additional information or they have follow-on questions, there's my contact information. And I'm always happy to continue the conversation. So with that, I'll turn it over to you to close it out.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Michelle, and thank you everyone for your busy days to attend. We really appreciate it. And we have another webinar coming up next week about learning and development. So make sure to check out our website, goco.io, to learn more information. And with that, I hope everyone has an incredible rest of your day, and I'll see you next time. Thank you again, Michelle.